The Battle of the Arar, also known as the Battle of the Saône, was one of the pivotal opening engagements of Julius Caesar's Gallic War. Fought in 58 BCE, this conflict marked a decisive moment in Caesar's campaign to subdue the tribes of Gaul and secure Roman dominance in the region. Though it may not have been the largest battle of the war, the events at the Arar River showcased Caesar's strategic brilliance, the discipline of his legions, and the swift nature of Roman military power. To truly understand the significance of this battle, we must first delve deeper into the context of Caesar's Gallic campaign, the Helvetii tribes' motivations for migrating, and how this clash came to be. For years, the Helvetii had lived in relative isolation, surrounded by the natural defences of the Alps to the south and east, and the River Rhine to the north. Their territory was fertile but confined, and the Helvetii population began to grow. Overpopulation, along with increasing pressure from Germanic tribes to the north, created a sense of urgency for the Helvetii to find a new homeland. They also sought the security that came from controlling more abundant and defensible territory, hoping to relocate to the more fertile lands of Western Gaul, near the Atlantic coast. In making their decision to migrate, the Helvetii were led by their noble class, including the prominent chieftain Augetorix. Augetorix had initially rallied the Helvetii around the vision of leaving their homeland to establish dominance in Gaul. However, before the migration could begin, Augetorix died, either by suicide or through assassination, depending on conflicting reports. His death created uncertainty, but did not stop the plan. The Helvetii, driven by both hope for a better future and fear of their Germanic neighbours, began their massive exodus, taking with them all their possessions, livestock and families. They burned their homes and villages to eliminate the possibility of retreat, committing themselves fully to their journey. At this time, Julius Caesar was serving as the governor of the Roman province of Transalpine Gaul, the region directly south of the Helvetii's proposed route. Caesar's position as governor came with both military and political responsibilities. He had been granted command over 4 legions and had been tasked with defending Roman interests in Gaul. However, Caesar had far grander ambitions than merely safeguarding the province. He sought military glory to strengthen his political position back in Rome. Gaul, with its various tribes and conflicts, provided the perfect theatre for Caesar to prove his military prowess. When Caesar learned of the Helvetii's intentions to migrate, he knew this movement presented both a threat and an opportunity. Allowing such a large and potentially hostile force to pass unchallenged could embolden other tribes to follow suit, undermining Roman authority in the region. On the other hand, successfully defeating the Helvetii could elevate Caesar's reputation both with his soldiers and the Senate. The stakes were high, and Caesar understood the importance of taking decisive action. The Helvetii migration was slow due to the sheer number of people and the logistical challenges of moving across rough terrain with wagons, livestock, and thousands of non-combatants. They travelled westward, seeking to cross the Rhone River and enter Roman territory. Caesar initially attempted to block them by building fortifications along the river. However, the Helvetii managed to outflank Caesar by crossing upstream and continuing their journey. Caesar, realizing the importance of halting the Helvetii's progress, quickly gathered his legions and marched to intercept them. The key moment came as the Helvetii began crossing the Arar River, which was known for its slow and winding course. The river, though not wide or fast-flowing, presented a natural barrier that the Helvetii needed to cross with their entire migration force. This process took days, as the Helvetii had to ferry their people, animals and supplies across the water on makeshift rafts and boats. When Caesar arrived with his legions, he saw that only part of the Helvetii force had made it to the far side of the river, leaving a significant number still vulnerable on the Roman side. Seeing this as a perfect opportunity to strike, Caesar acted swiftly. He ordered his troops to prepare for a surprise attack. His legions, well-trained and experienced from previous campaigns, were used to rapid deployment and disciplined action. Caesar's soldiers moved with speed and precision, taking the Helvetii by surprise. The Helvetii, preoccupied with the task of crossing the river, were not expecting an assault. They had no time to organize a proper defense. The Roman legions charged into the disorganized Helvetii force, cutting down many of the warriors who had been left behind to guard the crossing. The Helvetii, though fierce fighters, were at a significant disadvantage. Their forces were spread out and unprepared, while Caesar's legions were tightly coordinated and well armed. The battle was short but brutal. Thousands of Helvetii were killed, and those who survived were forced to flee across the river to join the rest of their people on the opposite bank. This tactical victory was crucial for Caesar. By striking at the Helvetii while they were divided, he weakened their overall strength and gained the upper hand in the campaign. Moreover, the psychological impact of the battle was profound. The Helvetii, who had believed that they could move through Gaul without serious opposition, now realized they faced a formidable and determined adversary in Caesar. The element of fear began to take hold within their ranks. For Caesar, this victory was more than just a military achievement. It was a demonstration of his leadership and strategic brilliance. He had successfully exploited the Helvetii's vulnerability and turned a minor skirmish into a decisive engagement. This success not only bolstered the morale of his legions, but also increased his standing among the Gallic tribes and back in Rome. News of Caesar's victory at the Arar spread quickly, and the Roman Senate, ever eager to hear of military triumphs, praised Caesar's actions. He had proven himself as a capable commander, willing to act decisively and protect Roman interests. In the aftermath of the battle, Caesar ordered his legions to build fortifications along the riverbank, securing their position and ensuring that the Helvetii could not easily recross the river. This allowed Caesar to consolidate his forces and plan his next move. He knew that the Helvetii were still a threat, but now they were weakened and demoralized. The Helvetii, on the other hand, were in disarray. Their leaders had not anticipated such a swift and devastating defeat. While they still had a sizable force, the loss at the Arar was a blow to their confidence. The realization that they were being pursued by a relentless Roman army forced them to reconsider their strategy. They could no longer rely on their numbers alone to guarantee success. In the weeks that followed, Caesar continued his pursuit of the Helvetii, engaging them in several skirmishes and wearing down their forces. The final showdown between Caesar and the Helvetii would come later at the Battle of Bibracte, where Caesar would once again demonstrate his tactical genius. But it was at the Arar that the tone for the Gallic War was set. Caesar had shown that he was not a passive governor, but a man of action, a leader who would go to great lengths to secure victory and protect Rome's interests. The Battle of the Arar is often overshadowed by the larger and more famous battles of Caesar's Gallic campaign, but it remains a critical moment in his early successes. It was here that Caesar first demonstrated the discipline and efficiency of his legions, as well as his ability to capitalize on his enemies' weaknesses. The battle also showed the importance of timing and terrain in warfare. Caesar's decision to strike while the Helvetii were divided by the river was a masterstroke, and it allowed him to gain a strategic advantage early in the campaign. Ultimately, the Battle of the Arar was not just a military victory, it was a turning point in Caesar's campaign to conquer Gaul. It marked the beginning of a series of engagements that would eventually lead to the subjugation of the Gallic tribes and the expansion of Roman power. For Caesar, the victory was a stepping stone on his path to greater glory, both as a military leader and as a political figure in Rome. As the Gallic War unfolded, Caesar would continue to build on the success of the Arar, using his military victories to solidify his position in Gaul and enhance his reputation back in Rome. The legacy of the Battle of the Arar, though often overlooked, remains a testament to the importance of strategy, leadership, and decisive action in the art of war. After the successful ambush at the Arar River, where Julius Caesar and his legions decisively struck a vulnerable portion of the Helvetii as they crossed the river, the Roman general knew his work was far from over. The Helvetii, although bloodied and temporarily shaken, had managed to continue their migration, regrouping with the remainder of their forces on the other side of the river. But Caesar wasn't about to let them slip away. He had no intention of allowing this large confederation of Gauls to roam freely through Gaul and pose a future threat to Roman interests. The Helvetii, realizing the threat Caesar posed, had increased the pace of their movement. Their goal remained the same: to find new lands in western Gaul beyond the reach of Roman control. However, the Battle of the Arar had instilled a new sense of urgency in their leaders. They now understood that Caesar would relentlessly pursue them if given the chance, and any misstep could lead to another disastrous encounter with the well-disciplined Roman legions. They had no time to lose. But Caesar, as always, was not one to sit idly by. After his victory at the Arar, he wasted no time reorganizing his forces. He knew the Helvetii had no intention of engaging in a full-scale battle just yet. They were still in a defensive posture, seeking to escape rather than confront his legions in a pitched battle. Caesar recognized that he needed to force them into a decisive engagement, and he had the advantage of superior mobility and discipline. His legions, though fewer in number than the Helvetii, were far more organized and capable of long marches. Caesar's decision to pursue the Helvetii led to a series of skirmishes as he harassed their rear guard, preventing them from gaining any substantial distance. His intention was clear: to slow them down, to exhaust them, and eventually to bring them to a point where they had no choice but to fight on his terms. His legions moved with precision, shadowing the Helvetii's every move, cutting off supply routes and making it clear that there would be no escape. Meanwhile, the Helvetii, burdened with their non-combatants, livestock and wagons full of supplies, could not match the speed of the Roman legions. They knew that they couldn't outrun Caesar indefinitely. As the days wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll on their people. Morale started to falter. The once bold confederation of tribes now found itself on the defensive, constantly looking over its shoulder, knowing that Caesar was closing in. As the Helvetii pressed forward, they found themselves nearing the hill town of Bibracte, the principal settlement of the Atuatuci, a Gallic tribe that had allied itself with Rome. Bibracte, situated on a high plateau, was an imposing sight, a fortified town, rich in resources and strategically important. It was here, in the shadow of Bibracte, that the Helvetii finally realized they had run out of options. They could not flee any farther without risking complete exhaustion. A confrontation with Caesar was now inevitable. For Caesar, the approach to Bibracte presented the perfect opportunity to finish what he had started at the Arar. The Helvetii were in a weakened state, their forces stretched thin from weeks of marching and their morale fragile after the constant Roman harassment. Caesar knew that a decisive victory here would not only end the Helvetii migration, but also send a powerful message to the other Gallic tribes. Rome would not tolerate any challenge to its authority. The final lead-up to the battle began with a skirmish. The Helvetii, realizing the Romans were right behind them, attempted to gain an advantageous position by occupying a nearby hill. They hoped that the high ground would give them a defensive edge. Caesar, ever the strategist, ordered his legions to halt and set up camp at the base of the hill. He did not intend to rush into battle recklessly. Instead, he wanted to control the terms of the engagement, knowing that patience and discipline would be his greatest allies. The night before the battle was tense. The Roman camp was abuzz with preparation. Soldiers repaired armor, sharpened their swords, and ensured their shields were ready for the coming fight. Caesar moved among his men, offering words of encouragement. His presence alone inspired confidence. These were hardened veterans, men who had fought in brutal conditions and knew that they were part of a well-oiled military machine. They trusted Caesar's judgment implicitly, knowing that under his leadership they had the upper hand. Across the field, the Helvetii were preparing in their own way. They knew the Romans would attack, but they also knew they had the advantage of numbers. Though they had suffered losses at the Arar, they still had tens of thousands of warriors capable of fighting. Their chieftains tried to rally the troops, reminding them of their ancestors' valour and urging them to defend their people and families. But underneath the speeches and war cries there was doubt. The Roman legions were unlike any enemy they had faced before, and Caesar's relentless pursuit had sapped their strength. As dawn broke over the Gallic countryside, the tension in the air was palpable. Caesar wasted no time. He knew that an early attack would catch the Helvetii off guard. His legions advanced with the precision that had come to define the Roman army. The Helvetii, for their part, were ready. They formed a massive line at the foot of the hill, stretching across the battlefield. Their numbers were impressive, but Caesar's men knew that discipline and coordination would win the day. The opening phase of the battle was fierce. The Helvetii, relying on their superior numbers, attempted to overwhelm the Roman lines with a series of charges. Their warriors, shouting war cries and brandishing swords, axes and spears, hurled themselves at the Roman shields. But the Romans, ever disciplined, held their ground. The famous Roman testudo, or tortoise formation, provided them with a near impenetrable defence. Their large rectangular shields locked together, creating a wall of steel and wood that absorbed the Helveti's initial onslaught. As the Helveti's first charge faltered, Caesar ordered his legions to counterattack. The Roman soldiers, wielding their short gladi with deadly precision, surged forward in a coordinated push. The Helvetii, caught off guard by the sudden shift in momentum, began to fall back. For all their bravery and numbers, they lacked the organization to withstand the relentless Roman advance. Caesar's legions, trained for close-quarters combat, systematically cut down the Gallic warriors, pressing them back toward their camp. The battle raged for hours. The Helvetii, desperate to turn the tide, launched several counterattacks, but each one was repelled by the disciplined Roman formations. Caesar's men were relentless, pushing the Helvetii farther and farther from the battlefield. The turning point came when Caesar ordered his cavalry to outflank the Helvetii and cut off their escape route. With the Roman cavalry closing in from the rear and the legions pressing forward from the front, the Helvetii found themselves trapped. Panic set in among the Gallic ranks. What had started as an organized defense quickly turned into a rout. The Helveti's warriors, realizing they were surrounded, began to break formation and flee in all directions. Caesar's cavalry, riding down the fleeing Gauls, ensured that few would escape. The battlefield, once filled with the clash of steel and the roar of battle, became eerily quiet as the last pockets of Helvetii resistance were crushed. By the end of the day, the Helveti's hopes of finding a new homeland had been utterly destroyed. Thousands lay dead on the battlefield, and the survivors, men, women and children, were taken prisoner by the Romans. Caesar, ever the pragmatic leader, treated the survivors with a degree of mercy. He allowed them to return to their homeland, but under strict conditions. The Helvetii would no longer pose a threat to Rome. The Battle of Bibracte was a decisive victory for Caesar. Not only had he defeated a formidable Gallic confederation, but he had also solidified his reputation as a brilliant military commander. News of his victory spread quickly throughout Gaul, and other tribes, seeing the fate of the Helvetii, began to rethink their stance toward Rome. For Caesar, the road ahead was clear. The conquest of Gaul had only just begun. As Caesar surveyed the battlefield, he knew that this victory, like the one at the Arar, would serve as a foundation for his future campaigns. The Gallic War was far from over, but with each battle, Caesar was securing his legacy. The Helvetii, once a powerful confederation, had been humbled. The other Gallic tribes, who had watched from the sidelines, now faced a choice. Resist Rome or submit? Caesar, ever calculating, knew that this victory was not just a military triumph, it was a message to all of Gaul. And so, with the Helvetii defeated and the Aedui firmly on Rome's side, Caesar turned his attention to the next phase of his campaign. The conquest of Gaul would be long and arduous, but with victories like Bibracte, Caesar knew that the prize was within his grasp. After the crushing victory over the Helvetii at the Battle of Bibracte, Julius Caesar's legions were both triumphant and weary. The long pursuit of the migrating tribe had ended in a decisive Roman victory, forcing the Helvetii to return to their homeland under Roman terms. Yet Caesar knew that Gaul was far from pacified. His campaign to bring this vast and diverse land under Roman control was only beginning. The Helvetii had been the first to challenge Rome's authority, but they were not the only threat. As word of Caesar's victory spread, the Gallic tribes that had remained neutral during the conflict with the Helvetii began to reconsider their stance. Many had hoped that the Helvetii would weaken Caesar enough to limit his influence in Gaul, but the opposite had happened. Now, Gaul's tribes faced a dilemma: submit to Rome's growing power or risk being conquered one by one. But there was another force at play in Gaul, one that Caesar had yet to confront directly: the Germans. For years, Germanic tribes had been crossing the Rhine, pushing deeper into Gaul, displacing local tribes and threatening the stability of the region. Among them, one leader had risen to power, a king named Ariovistus. A chieftain of the Suebi, Ariovistus had established himself as a formidable presence in Gaul, ruling over the Sequani tribe and commanding a powerful coalition of German warriors. Ariovistus had initially been on good terms with Rome. In fact, the Roman Senate had even granted him the title of Friend of the Roman People, when his influence in Gaul had seemed useful to Roman interests. But times had changed. With Caesar's ambitions in Gaul becoming clear, Ariovistus no longer saw Rome as an ally. Instead, he viewed the Roman presence as a direct threat to his power. Tensions between Ariovistus and Caesar were inevitable, and it wasn't long before they came to a head. The Aedui, a Gallic tribe allied with Rome, had been suffering under the dominance of Ariovistus and his Germanic forces. They appealed to Caesar for help, reminding him of their alliance and pleading for Roman intervention. Caesar, eager to remove any rival power from Gaul and consolidate his control, decided that the time had come to confront Ariovistus directly. But Caesar was no fool. He understood that Ariovistus commanded a formidable force, one bolstered by the fierce reputation of Germanic warriors. Unlike the Helvetii, the Germans were not fleeing or seeking new lands. They were conquerors, and they intended to remain in Gaul. If Caesar were to defeat Ariovistus, it would not be a simple matter of outmaneuvering a migrating tribe. This would be a direct confrontation with a powerful king and his battle-hardened warriors. With the decision made, Caesar began preparations for the campaign. His legions, fresh from their victory over the Helvetii, were experienced and battle-ready, but they would be facing an entirely different kind of enemy. The Germans were known for their ferocity, their reliance on fast-moving cavalry, and their sheer physical power. Caesar's strategy would need to adapt to these new conditions. Before committing his forces, Caesar attempted diplomacy. He sent envoys to Ariovistus, requesting a meeting to discuss terms. But Ariovistus, confident in his position and unwilling to cede any ground to the Romans, responded with contempt. He refused to meet with Caesar and made it clear that he would not tolerate any Roman interference in his affairs. The message was unmistakable. Ariovistus considered Gaul his domain, and Caesar was an invader. This rebuff only strengthened Caesar's resolve. He could not allow a rival like Ariovistus to challenge Rome's authority in Gaul. War was now inevitable. Caesar's legions marched north into the territory controlled by Ariovistus, determined to bring the German king to battle. As they advanced, reports came in from scouts and local tribes, painting a grim picture of Ariovistus' forces. The German king had gathered a massive army, one that far outnumbered Caesar's legions. Caesar, however, remained undaunted. His confidence in his men and his own tactical genius gave him the edge he needed. He knew that the discipline and experience of the Roman legions would outweigh the raw power of the Germanic warriors. But there was still one crucial element missing. He needed to draw Ariovistus out into the open, where his legions could fight on favourable ground. Ariovistus, for his part, was not eager to engage Caesar directly. Despite his bravado, the German king knew that the Roman legions were not to be underestimated. He had hoped that his initial show of defiance would cause Caesar to back down, but the Roman general had pressed forward. Now, Ariovistus found himself in a difficult position. His army was large, but it was also composed of warriors from different tribes, many of whom had little loyalty to him. If Caesar could find a way to exploit this weakness, the German coalition could fall apart. The standoff between the two armies lasted for days. Caesar's legions camped near the Vosges mountains, while Ariovistus kept his forces on high ground, avoiding a direct confrontation. Skirmishes broke out along the edges of the battlefield, with Roman cavalry testing the German lines and probing for weaknesses. But the full-scale battle that both leaders knew was coming had yet to occur. Frustrated by the stalemate, Caesar decided to take a more aggressive approach. He ordered his legions to march closer to the German camp, hoping to provoke Ariovistus into action. The gamble worked. Unwilling to allow the Romans to move any closer, Ariovistus finally agreed to a meeting with Caesar. The two leaders met in a neutral location between their armies, each surrounded by a small escort of their most trusted men. The meeting was tense from the start. Caesar, ever the diplomat, offered Ariovistus terms that would allow him to retain his power in Gaul, but under Roman oversight. Ariovistus, however, had no interest in being a Roman puppet. He demanded that Caesar withdraw from Gaul entirely and allow the Germans to expand their influence as they saw fit. The negotiation quickly broke down, and both men returned to their camps, knowing that the time for words was over. The next morning, the armies prepared for battle. Caesar's legions, well rested and organized, formed up in their traditional lines, ready to meet the Germanic charge. Across the field, Ariovistus's warriors prepared for a different kind of fight. The Germans relied on shock and intimidation, charging at full speed in an attempt to break the enemy's line with brute force. They had used this tactic successfully against the Gauls, but Caesar was confident that his disciplined soldiers could withstand the initial onslaught. The Battle of the Vosges began with a thunderous clash. The Germans charged, their warriors howling as they hurled themselves at the Roman lines. Caesar's legions stood firm, their shields locked together in a nearly impenetrable wall. The first wave of Germans crashed against the Roman line, but the legions held. Slowly, methodically, Caesar's soldiers began to push back, using their short swords to cut down the Germans at close range. Ariovistus, seeing that his initial attack had failed to break the Romans, threw his cavalry into the fray. German horsemen, armed with long spears, rode into the Roman flanks, hoping to exploit any weakness in Caesar's formation. But Caesar had anticipated this move. He had placed his own cavalry, bolstered by allied Gallic horsemen, on the flanks, ready to counter any cavalry assault. The two mounted forces collided in a brutal melee, but once again Roman discipline won out. As the battle wore on, the tide began to turn in Caesar's favour. The Germans, unable to break the Roman lines, began to tire. Their disorganized charges became less effective, and Caesar's legions took advantage. With a single command, Caesar ordered a full advance. The Roman legions surged forward, cutting through the German ranks with precision. The German warriors, seeing that the battle was lost, began to retreat. Ariovistus, watching from a distance, realized that his position was untenable. He had underestimated Caesar and the strength of the Roman legions. The German king fled the battlefield with a small retinue of loyal warriors, abandoning his army to the Romans. By the end of the day, the battlefield was littered with the bodies of fallen Germans, while Caesar's legions stood victorious once again. The Battle of the Vosges marked a turning point in Caesar's Gallic campaign. With Ariovistus defeated and his army shattered, the Germanic threat in Gaul was effectively neutralized. Caesar's reputation as a military commander grew even stronger, and the tribes of Gaul, seeing the fate of Ariovistus, began to realize that resistance to Rome was futile. But Caesar knew that his work in Gaul was far from over. Other challenges awaited him, and he was ready to face them. Fresh off his victory against Ariovistus and the Germanic tribes, Julius Caesar turned his attention to a new and growing threat in Gaul, the Belgae. Comprising a coalition of numerous powerful tribes, the Belgae inhabited the northernmost regions of Gaul, bordering the territory of modern-day Belgium. These fiercely independent warriors had not yet felt the full weight of Roman power, but they had watched Caesar's campaigns with increasing alarm. The conquest of the Helvetii and the defeat of the Germans under Ariovistus were clear signals that Caesar intended to bring all of Gaul under Roman control. The Belgae, unwilling to see their autonomy disappear, chose to act before it was too late. Word had reached Caesar that the Belgae were gathering a massive confederation of tribes in a bid to drive the Romans out of Gaul. The coalition was said to number hundreds of thousands, a staggering force composed of warriors from tribes like the Bellovaci, the Nervii, and the Suessiones. United by their common cause, these tribes planned to strike at Caesar before he could march into their lands. For the Belgae, this was not merely a defensive war. They intended to confront Caesar with overwhelming force and crush his legions before they could threaten their independence. Caesar, never one to sit idle, moved quickly to counter this threat. His intelligence network had kept him well informed of the Belgae's movements, and he knew that they intended to move south and engage him before he could muster reinforcements. Deciding that the best defence was a swift offence, Caesar gathered his legions and marched north toward the territory of the Belgae. Despite the looming threat, Caesar felt confident. His legions had been hardened by years of fighting in Gaul, and their victories over the Helvetii and Ariovistus had only increased their confidence. The discipline of the Roman army, combined with Caesar's tactical genius, was a formidable force that had yet to meet its match in Gaul. Nevertheless, Caesar did not underestimate the Belgae. Their numbers were vast, and they had the advantage of defending their own territory. This would be a very different kind of battle compared to the campaigns against the migrating Helvetii or the isolated Germans. Caesar's first task was to secure a defensible position. He chose to march his legions toward the river Axona, modern-day Ain, which would serve as a natural barrier between his army and the Belgae. Upon reaching the river, Caesar immediately ordered his men to construct a fortified camp on the southern bank. The river would protect one flank of his army, and from this strong position he could either wait for the Belgae to attack or launch his own offensive when the moment was right. The Belgae, meanwhile, had been gathering their forces. Their coalition, led by the Suessiones, Bellovaci and Nervii, was formidable not only in size, but in the sheer ferocity of its warriors. These were not disorganized tribesmen. The Belgae had a long tradition of warfare, and their warriors were known for their courage and endurance. Many of them had fought against the Germans and other tribes for generations, and they were eager to test themselves against Caesar's legions. As Caesar's legions settled into their fortified camp, scouts reported that the Belgae were moving closer. The sheer size of the Belgic army was daunting. It stretched for miles, and the ground trembled beneath the feet of thousands of warriors. Caesar, however, remained calm. He knew that his position along the river was strong, and he had full confidence in the discipline and training of his men. But he also understood that the Belgae sheer numbers could overwhelm even the best defences if they were allowed to gather their full strength and charge across the river. He needed to act decisively. To disrupt the Belgic forces and prevent them from crossing the river en masse, Caesar devised a plan. He ordered his cavalry and light infantry to make forays across the river, harassing the Belgic vanguard and forcing them into defensive positions. The goal was not to engage the full Belgic force in open battle, but rather to sow confusion and prevent them from organizing a coordinated assault on the Roman camp. The plan worked. The Roman cavalry, supported by archers and slingers, struck quickly and withdrew before the Belgic warriors could mount a counterattack. These hit-and-run tactics frustrated the Belgic leaders, who found it difficult to muster their forces for a full-scale attack while under constant harassment. For several days, this pattern continued, with Caesar's cavalry launching raids and then withdrawing behind the protection of the river. But Caesar knew that he could not rely on these tactics forever. The Belgae, despite their disarray, were still a massive and dangerous force. Eventually, they would find a way to cross the river, and when they did, Caesar would need to be ready. So he prepared his legions for battle. His engineers constructed a bridge across the Axona, allowing his troops to quickly move from one side of the river to the other. At the same time, he sent messengers to his allies among the Aedui and other Gallic tribes, requesting reinforcements. The moment finally came when the Belgic coalition, growing impatient with Caesar's delaying tactics, decided to make a direct assault on the Roman position. Thousands of Belgic warriors surged toward the river, their war cries echoing across the valley. Caesar's legions stood ready. As the Belgae charged, they were met with a hail of Roman javelins, the famous pilum, which tore through their ranks and slowed their advance. The Belgae pushed forward, but the river and the well-fortified Roman camp proved formidable obstacles. Seeing that the Belgae were struggling to cross the river and maintain their momentum, Caesar seized the opportunity to launch a counterattack. He ordered his legions to cross the bridge and engage the Belgae on the opposite bank. The Roman soldiers, disciplined and battle-hardened, advanced in formation, their shields locked together as they pushed into the mass of Belgic warriors. What followed was a brutal close-quarters battle. The Belgae fought with the ferocity they were known for, but Caesar's legions, with their superior training and discipline, began to gain the upper hand. As the Roman infantry pushed forward, Caesar's cavalry circled around the Belgic flanks, cutting off any chance of retreat. The Belgae, realizing that they were being surrounded, began to fall back in disarray. Some tribes managed to retreat in good order, but many were cut down as they fled toward the river. The Battle of the Axona was not a complete annihilation of the Belgic forces, but it was a decisive Roman victory. Caesar had successfully defended his camp, inflicted heavy casualties on the Belgic coalition, and forced the remaining Belgic forces to withdraw. The defeat shattered the unity of the Belgic tribes. Many of them, including the powerful Suessiones, sent emissaries to Caesar offering surrender and pledging allegiance to Rome. In the aftermath of the battle, Caesar moved swiftly to secure the region. He pursued the retreating Belgic forces, capturing many of their leaders and bringing their territories under Roman control. The fall of the Belgic coalition marked the beginning of Roman dominance in northern Gaul. Although there would be further resistance from other tribes, the Belgae had been the greatest threat to Caesar's campaign in this region, and their defeat opened the way for the Roman conquest of the rest of Gaul. The victory at the Battle of the Axona also had a profound psychological effect on the remaining Gallic tribes. The speed and decisiveness of Caesar's victory over such a large and powerful coalition made it clear that resistance to Rome was futile. Over the next few months, tribe after tribe submitted to Caesar's authority, either through negotiation or after brief military engagements. However, not all tribes were willing to submit so easily. The Nervi, one of the fiercest and most warlike tribes of the Belgic Confederation, were still preparing to resist Caesar. They had not taken part in the Battle of the Axona, preferring to bide their time and wait for a moment when they could strike at the Romans on their own terms. Caesar knew that the defeat of the Belgae was only one step in his campaign. The Gallic wars were far from over, and he would soon face one of his greatest challenges yet, the battle against the Nervi. As Caesar's legions secured their hold over northern Gaul, he began to prepare for the next phase of his conquest. The battle-hardened Roman soldiers had proven themselves time and again, and their loyalty to Caesar was unwavering. With each victory, Caesar's reputation as a commander grew, not just among the Romans, but among the Gauls as well. But he also knew that the greatest challenges were still to come. The Battle of the Axona was a crucial step in Caesar's conquest of Gaul, demonstrating his ability to outmaneuver and outfight even the largest tribal coalitions. The discipline and tactics of the Roman legions, combined with Caesar's strategic brilliance, had once again secured a decisive victory. But as the Roman eagle advanced further into Gaul, new enemies were already gathering their strength, waiting for their chance to strike. After securing a decisive victory over the Belgian Confederation at the Battle of the Axona, Julius Caesar's legions marched deeper into Gaul, driven by the ambition of total conquest. The legions were confident but battle-weary. They had experienced many campaigns, but they knew that ahead lay one of the fiercest adversaries they would face, the Nervi. Unlike other Gallic tribes, the Nervi did not negotiate, did not send emissaries to Rome, and had no interest in the Roman promise of protection. For centuries, the Nervi had defended their lands from invaders, preserving their fiercely independent way of life. Located deep in the forests and wetlands of northern Gaul, near the Sambre River, their homeland provided natural defences that suited their guerrilla warfare tactics. The Nervi had never succumbed to foreign invaders, and they did not intend to now. The Nervi were also unlike other tribes in another way. They had banned all luxury items, a conscious decision to reject the increasing Roman influence that had infiltrated many other Gallic societies. In Nervi culture, wealth was measured not in gold or foreign goods, but in strength, loyalty, and the honour of their warriors. This made them all the more dangerous. They saw the Romans as more than an enemy. They saw them as a threat to their very identity. Despite Caesar's victory at the Axona, the Nervi had remained ominously silent, refusing to engage directly in battle or negotiations. They had, however, been silently preparing, gathering allies and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Unbeknownst to Caesar, they had already forged alliances with the Atrebates and the Viromandui, swelling their numbers and pooling their warriors for a combined force that, in their minds, would be unstoppable. As the legions crossed into Nervi territory, the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Caesar, though seasoned in war, sensed that something was amiss. Scouts reported that the forests were unnervingly quiet. No traders, no animals, no signs of normal life. Caesar, known for his calculated risk-taking, ordered his troops to proceed with caution. The landscape around the Sambre River was a dangerous one for a marching army. The dense forests gave way to sudden clearings, and the river itself was flanked by steep banks and thick underbrush, perfect conditions for an ambush. But Caesar had no choice. He needed to engage the Nervi to secure the area, and, as always, the legions would need to adapt to the terrain. The Nervi, lying in wait for weeks, had prepared their ambush with meticulous care. Knowing the Roman army would follow the natural path along the Sambre, they had concealed their forces in the thick woods and tall grass surrounding the riverbanks. Their strategy was simple yet devastating. Strike the Romans when they were most vulnerable, mid-march and while setting up camp. Caesar's legions, unaware of the extent of the threat that lay ahead, began to construct their fortified camp along the river's edge. The Roman army had always prided itself on its efficient camp building. Every day, regardless of whether they would stay the night, the soldiers built a defensive structure, complete with trenches and ramparts, ensuring they could hold off any potential attacks. As the camp began to take shape, the Nervi saw their opportunity. From the dense cover of the forest, their war horns blasted through the air, and a massive wave of Gallic warriors poured out of the trees, rushing toward the unprepared Romans. It was a scene of chaos, as thousands of Nervi, Atrebates, and Viramundui warriors surged forward, their war cries echoing across the battlefield. The Nervi moved with terrifying speed and coordination. They knew the Roman army's strength lay in its disciplined formations, so they sought to break these lines before the Romans could organize themselves. They attacked from all sides, focusing their efforts on the sections of the army that had not yet fully entrenched themselves. Caesar, taken aback by the swiftness of the attack, immediately sprang into action. His first priority was to rally his scattered troops. From atop his horse, he rode through the ranks, shouting orders, his voice cutting through the din of battle. His veteran soldiers, recognizing the danger, quickly formed up into the defensive formations that had saved them in countless battles before. The Roman legions were nothing if not disciplined. Though the Nervi had the advantage of surprise, the Romans were not easily shaken. The soldiers on the front lines locked their shields together in the classic Roman testudo, a near-impenetrable wall of shields that could absorb the force of even the fiercest assault. Behind this shield wall, the legionnaires thrust their gladi with deadly precision, cutting down any warrior who got too close. But despite their discipline, the Romans were struggling. The Nervi fought with a reckless ferocity, throwing themselves at the Roman lines with abandon. For every Nervi warrior that fell, another seemed to take their place. The Romans were outnumbered, and their defences were still incomplete. Seeing his men faltering, Caesar made a bold decision. He personally led a contingent of his cavalry to strike at the Nervi's flank. He knew that a direct confrontation would be disastrous, so instead he sought to disrupt the Nervi's coordination. As the Roman cavalry charged into the Nervi warriors, chaos erupted within the Gallic ranks. Caesar's maneuver, though risky, bought his infantry valuable time to regroup. As the battle raged on, the Roman legions gradually regained control. With their formations solidified, they began to push back against the Nervi assault. The Nervi, realizing that their chance to overwhelm the Romans had passed, fought with even greater desperation. They knew that if they failed here, their entire way of life would be in jeopardy. For hours the battle raged, neither side willing to give ground. The banks of the Sambre River ran red with blood as both Roman and Nervi warriors fell in droves. The ground, once soft from recent rains, became a quagmire of mud and blood, making movement difficult and adding to the chaos. In the heat of battle, Roman centurions barked orders to their soldiers, keeping their formations tight and methodical. The Nervi, by contrast, operated with less structure but far more emotional intensity, with small groups of warriors repeatedly charging the Roman lines, hoping to break their discipline. The Nervi's courage was unmatched, but the Romans' discipline and tactical superiority began to show. Slowly but surely, Caesar's legions pressed forward inch by bloody inch, forcing the Nervi back toward the river. Caesar himself remained in the thick of the battle, directing his forces with precision. His ability to remain calm and focused in the heat of battle was one of his greatest strengths as a commander, and it was on full display at the Sambre. Finally, As dusk began to fall, the battle reached its climax. The Nervii, exhausted and outnumbered, made one last desperate push against the Roman lines, but it was too late. The Roman legions, now fully entrenched and emboldened by their defensive positions, held firm. The Nervi's final assault was shattered against the unyielding Roman shields. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, the battle was over. The Nervii had been defeated, their forces decimated. Only a few survivors managed to escape into the forest, their once proud tribe now broken. For Caesar, the victory was bittersweet. The Nervii had fought with incredible bravery and skill, and he respected them as worthy adversaries. In his reports to Rome, he would later describe the Nervii as one of the fiercest tribes he had ever encountered. Their defeat, while necessary for the Roman conquest of Gaul, marked the end of a proud and noble people. As the Roman legions set up their camp for the night, the fires of the camp flickered in the darkness. Caesar, ever the strategist, began to plan his next move. The victory at the Sabis was a crucial one, but he knew that more battles lay ahead. The Gallic War was far from over, and while the Nervii had been defeated, other tribes would surely rise to take their place. But for now, the Roman legions could rest, knowing that they had once again proven their superiority on the battlefield. The Battle of the Sabis would go down in history as one of Caesar's greatest victories, a testament to his tactical genius and the indomitable spirit of his legions. As Caesar's legions advanced deeper into the heart of Gaul, they encountered tribes determined to resist the Roman invasion. Among these was the Atuatuci, a fierce and proud tribe descended from the Germanic peoples. They had watched as Caesar dismantled tribe after tribe across Gaul and had vowed to stand firm against the Roman war machine. Their stronghold, perched atop a steep and defensible hill, was thought to be impenetrable, and they believed themselves invulnerable within its mighty walls. But Julius Caesar, fresh from his victories at the Battle of the Axona and the Battle of the Sabis, was not a man to leave any enemy unchecked. The Atuatuci would face the full force of his strategic genius and the disciplined might of the Roman legions. Following his victory over the Nervii, Caesar's army was confident but fatigued. They had fought a grueling campaign and now faced another fierce tribe. Yet Caesar understood the importance of maintaining momentum. The Atuatuci, with their fortified city, represented a significant obstacle in his bid to subdue Gaul. Allowing them to remain unconquered would leave a threat at his back, one that could inspire other tribes to resist Roman rule. The Atuatuci had retreated into their hilltop fortress, surrounded on all sides by steep cliffs. To the outside observer, the city seemed untouchable. But Caesar, ever the tactician, knew better. While the Atuatuci relied on their natural defences, Caesar relied on his experience in siege warfare. He ordered his engineers to begin constructing siege equipment. Roman legions had perfected the art of siegecraft, and under Caesar's command they built siege towers, battering rams and ballistae capable of hurling massive projectiles over the walls. The soldiers also dug trenches and built their own fortifications around the Atuatuci's city, ensuring that no one could leave without Roman permission. To the Atuatuci, watching from their walls, the sight of the Roman legions methodically building their siege works was a chilling one. Day by day, the Roman army seemed to grow closer to their city, their walls feeling less and less impenetrable. The Atuatuci were not a tribe to submit easily. From their high vantage point, they hurled insults at the Roman soldiers below, taunting them for their perceived arrogance. How could they hope to breach these walls? The city had never been taken in all the long years of its existence, and the Atuatuci believed it never would be. But Caesar, ever pragmatic, was not deterred by words. He understood that wars were won through action, not bravado. He had already laid the groundwork for success by cutting off the Atuatuci's supply lines. The city was surrounded, and the people within were growing increasingly desperate. Time was on Caesar's side. Inside the city, however, the Atuatuci leaders were faced with a difficult decision. Their bravado could only carry them so far. Supplies were running low, and with no hope of reinforcement, they would soon be unable to feed their people or their warriors. The city's council met in secret to discuss their options. Some advocated for a final stand, a glorious last battle against the Romans, believing that the gods would favour their courage. Others, more pragmatic, urged the council to negotiate with Caesar before it was too late. After much debate, they reached a decision. They would send envoys to Caesar, not to surrender, but to stall for time. The Atuatuci envoys arrived at the Roman camp under a banner of peace. Dressed in their finest garments, they presented themselves as humble and apologetic. They explained to Caesar that their people had been misled into opposing the Romans. The true leaders, they claimed, sought only peace. They wished to surrender the city to Caesar and end the bloodshed, but they requested mercy for their people. Caesar listened carefully to their words, but was not easily fooled. His experience in Gaul had taught him that diplomacy was often a tool used by desperate tribes to buy time. However, he had no reason to refuse their offer. A peaceful resolution, if genuine, would save Roman lives and allow his army to continue its conquest without delay. But Caesar was cautious. He agreed to accept their surrender on the condition that they turn over all of their weapons. The Atuatuci, after feigning reluctance, agreed to Caesar's terms. Over the next few days, they brought out vast quantities of arms, spears, shields, swords and axes, all piled before the Roman camp. The sheer volume of the weapons seemed to confirm their sincerity. Yet Caesar remained suspicious. He had seen the Gallic tribes use deception before, and he had no intention of being caught off guard. Though the Atuatuci had disarmed themselves, Caesar quietly ordered his men to remain vigilant. He doubled the number of guards around the camp and prepared for the possibility of treachery. Caesar's caution proved well-founded. On the night following the supposed surrender, the Atuatuci launched a surprise attack. Armed with weapons they had hidden from the Romans, they stormed out of their city in the dead of night, hoping to catch Caesar's army off guard. The Atuatuci warriors, fierce and desperate, poured down the steep slopes toward the Roman camp, hoping to break through the Roman lines and escape into the countryside. For a moment, it seemed as though they might succeed. The suddenness of the attack, combined with the ferocity of the Atuatuci fighters, threw the Roman guards into momentary confusion. But Caesar's foresight had prepared his army for such an eventuality. The additional guards, reinforced defences, and the ever-disciplined Roman legions quickly responded to the threat. As the Atuatuci neared the Roman walls, they were met with a barrage of missiles, javelins, arrows and stones, hurled from Roman catapults and slingers. The Atuatuci fought with incredible bravery, but they were no match for the disciplined Roman soldiers. The legions, locked in tight formations, repelled the assault with brutal efficiency. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the Atuatuci realized that their final gamble had failed. The survivors retreated back to their city, exhausted and defeated. With their last desperate attempt to break the Roman siege thwarted, the Atuatuci had no choice but to surrender. This time, there were no more tricks. Caesar's legions advanced on the city, their siege towers and battering rams finally put to use. The walls that had once seemed so invincible crumbled before the might of Roman engineering. The Roman soldiers poured into the city, and the Atuatuci, now utterly broken, could offer no further resistance. Caesar, in a rare show of clemency, chose not to slaughter the entire population. Instead, he enslaved them, sending tens of thousands of Atuatuci into chains, a grim reminder to the rest of Gaul of the price of opposing Rome. The fall of the Atuatuci was a significant moment in Caesar's conquest of Gaul. It demonstrated the futility of resistance against the Roman war machine and sent a clear message to any other tribe considering rebellion. No fortress, no matter how strong, could stand against the might and determination of Rome. The aftermath of the siege saw Caesar consolidating his gains in the region, ensuring that no tribe could offer aid to the Atuatuci or attempt to mount a rebellion of their own. The swift Roman victory sent shockwaves through Gaul, further solidifying the reputation of Caesar and his legions as an unstoppable force. As Caesar's army moved on, leaving behind the smouldering remains of the Atuatuci's once proud city, the tribes of Gaul took notice. Some began to consider submission to Roman rule, while others, still defiant, plotted in the shadows. For Caesar, this was only one of many battles in his relentless pursuit of dominance over Gaul. With the Atuatuci defeated, his focus would shift to the next challenge, the next battle, the next conquest. But the Gallic Wars were far from over. While many tribes had been crushed under the weight of Roman arms, others were preparing to resist with newfound vigour. Caesar's name now struck fear into the hearts of his enemies, but for some it also ignited a fire of rebellion. The siege of the Atuatuci was a testament to Caesar's strategic brilliance and the discipline of his legions. It showed the world that no enemy, no matter how fortified or determined, could stand against Rome. Yet it also marked the beginning of a new phase in the Gallic Wars, one where the tribes of Gaul would no longer underestimate their Roman foe. In the future, battles would be fought with even greater ferocity, and Caesar's conquest of Gaul would only become more brutal. But for now, with the Atuatuci defeated and enslaved, Caesar could claim yet another victory on his path to complete domination of Gaul. After his stunning victories across Gaul, Julius Caesar had established himself as a near-invincible force. The legions marched under his banner, and most of the Gallic tribes had either surrendered or been subdued. But in 52 BCE, the tide of war was beginning to change. Caesar was no longer dealing with disorganized tribal factions. The rise of a formidable Gallic leader, Vercingetorix, chief of the Arverni tribe, would soon challenge everything Caesar had built. And it was at Gergovia that Caesar would face one of his greatest tests, a rare and humbling defeat. The Gallic tribes, once fragmented and often at odds with one another, had found a charismatic and capable leader in Vercingetorix. He was not only a brilliant tactician, but also a master at uniting the often fractious tribes. Rallying under his leadership, the Gauls now posed a formidable threat. Vercingetorix had learned from Caesar's campaigns, adapting his strategies and focusing on fortifying key positions. His decision to take a stand at Gergovia would be a pivotal moment in the Gallic resistance. Gergovia was a well-fortified hilltop city in the heart of the Arverni territory. The natural landscape surrounding the city provided a strong defensive position. Steep cliffs, dense forests and rugged terrain made it almost impregnable. It was here that Vercingetorix had gathered his forces, confident that the Romans could not easily dislodge him. For Caesar, Gergovia presented a new kind of challenge. Unlike many of his previous battles, which involved field engagements, Gergovia was a siege, a test not just of Roman discipline, but of strategic cunning and patience. Caesar knew that taking Gergovia would be difficult, but he also understood the symbolic importance of the city. If he could crush Vercingetorix here, it would break the back of the Gallic resistance. But if he failed, the Gauls would grow bolder, and his reputation as an unstoppable conqueror would be questioned. As Caesar's legions approached Gergovia, the tension was palpable. His men, veterans of countless battles, knew this would be unlike anything they had faced before. The towering heights of the city loomed ahead, and the Gallic warriors manning the walls were eager to defend their homes. Vercingetorix, from his fortified position, watched the Roman legions with confidence. He knew that the terrain was in his favour, and Caesar would be forced to fight an uphill battle, literally. Caesar, ever the strategist, began his approach with caution. He ordered his legions to construct camps at strategic points around the city, cutting off supply routes and attempting to isolate the Gauls within Gergovia. At first, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Caesar's forces had managed to seize key positions on the lower slopes of the hill, and the Roman siege machines were brought forward to batter the walls. But the Gauls, under Vercingetorix's command, were well prepared. They harassed the Romans with constant skirmishes and ambushes, exploiting their superior knowledge of the terrain. One of Caesar's strengths had always been his ability to anticipate his enemies' moves, but at Gergovia things did not unfold as expected. The Gauls fought with a tenacity that Caesar had not yet encountered in this campaign. Vercingetorix's leadership had inspired them, and they fought not just for survival, but for the freedom of all Gaul. As the days dragged on, Caesar realized that his usual tactics of quick, decisive engagements were not working. The Gauls were content to sit behind their walls, launching sorties to keep the Romans off balance, but refusing to engage in a full-scale battle. Caesar's frustration grew. He needed to find a way to draw the Gauls out or break their defences. In a bold move, Caesar decided to launch a feigned retreat. He hoped that by withdrawing some of his forces, Vercingetorix might be tempted to leave the safety of Gergovia and pursue the Romans. If Vercingetorix took the bait, Caesar could then turn his legions around and attack the Gauls in the open. But Vercingetorix, ever the cautious leader, was not fooled. He held his forces inside the city, refusing to fall into Caesar's trap. With the feigned retreat having failed, Caesar opted for a more direct approach. He ordered a full-scale assault on the city's lower defences, hoping to breach Gergovia's outer fortifications and force the Gauls into a decisive confrontation. The Roman legions, disciplined and experienced, moved forward with precision. But the steep terrain and the well-fortified positions of the Gauls made the assault difficult from the start. The fighting was fierce. Roman soldiers clambered up the hills, trying to scale the walls under a constant barrage of arrows, stones and javelins from the Gallic defenders. Vercingetorix, watching from the heights, directed his warriors with skill and precision. The Gauls had the high ground, and every Roman advance was met with brutal resistance. Despite the overwhelming odds, Caesar's legions managed to gain a foothold on part of the city's outer defences. For a moment it seemed as though victory might be within their grasp, but then disaster struck. The Roman forces had overextended themselves, pushing too far into enemy territory without securing their flanks. Vercingetorix, seeing an opportunity, ordered a counterattack. The Gauls surged from their positions, hitting the Romans with a ferocity that took them by surprise. The Roman legions, isolated and vulnerable, were forced to retreat. What had initially seemed like a breakthrough quickly turned into a rout. Caesar, realizing the danger, ordered his men to fall back to their camps. But the damage had been done. The defeat at Gergovia was a bitter pill for Caesar to swallow. For the first time in the Gallic campaign, he had been forced to retreat in the face of the enemy. His legions, though still loyal and formidable, had suffered a rare setback. Vercingetorix, on the other hand, had achieved a great victory. His strategy of defensive warfare, combined with the natural advantages of Gergovia's terrain, had paid off. For Caesar, Gergovia was a moment of reflection. He had underestimated the resilience of the Gallic people and the leadership of Vercingetorix. But Caesar was not one to dwell on failure. He knew that this defeat, while significant, was not the end of the campaign. Gergovia had been a costly lesson, but it had also provided him with valuable insights into the strengths and weaknesses of his enemy. Vercingetorix, emboldened by his victory, sought to capitalize on the momentum. He sent messengers to other Gallic tribes, urging them to rise up against the Romans. The defeat at Gergovia had proven that Caesar was not invincible, and the time to strike back at Rome was now. Across Gaul, tribes that had previously stayed neutral or even allied with the Romans began to reconsider their positions. But Caesar, ever the tactician, was already planning his next move. He knew that Vercingetorix would likely try to rally more tribes to his cause, and he could not allow the Gallic leader to consolidate his power. While Gergovia had been a setback, Caesar was determined to end the Gallic rebellion once and for all. In the days following the battle, Caesar regrouped his forces. He sent out scouts to monitor the movements of Vercingetorix's army and began to formulate a plan. Gergovia had shown him that a direct assault on a well-fortified position was not always the best course of action. He would need to find a way to draw Vercingetorix out into the open, where the discipline and organization of the Roman legions could once again prove decisive. As the campaign continued, Caesar's focus shifted from Gergovia to Alesia, where the final decisive battle of the Gallic Wars would take place. But the memory of Gergovia lingered. It had been a rare defeat for Caesar, a reminder that even the greatest generals were not infallible. Vercingetorix's victory at Gergovia would stand as a symbol of Gallic resistance, a testament to the strength and determination of the tribes that had dared to defy Rome. But Caesar, as always, remained undeterred. The road to victory might be longer than he had anticipated, but he knew that the ultimate prize, complete control of Gaul, was still within his grasp. Gergovia was a battle that shaped the course of the Gallic Wars, a pivotal moment where Caesar learned the price of underestimating his enemies. Though the Romans were forced to retreat, Caesar's resilience and strategic brilliance would soon turn the tide once again in his favour. The siege of Gergovia marked not the end of the war, but the beginning of a new and more determined phase in Caesar's conquest of Gaul. After his defeat at Gergovia, Julius Caesar found himself at a pivotal moment in his campaign in Gaul. The Gallic tribes were more unified than ever, their morale bolstered by the recent Roman failure. Caesar knew that he had to act swiftly to regain control of the situation. Gergovia had shown his enemies that Rome was not invincible, and whispers of rebellion spread across Gaul like wildfire. If he was to maintain his grip over this vast and challenging land, Caesar needed a bold, strategic victory to reassert Roman dominance. His eyes fell upon Lutetia, a key stronghold of the Parisii tribe, which held both strategic and symbolic importance. Lutetia, a settlement on an island in the river Seine, was the heart of the Parisii, one of the tribes that had chosen to ally with Vercingetorix and oppose Roman rule. Situated where the Seine River narrowed, it provided a natural defence, with marshes surrounding its approaches. This ancient city stood as a symbol of resistance for the Gauls, and taking it would send a powerful message to those tribes still contemplating rebellion. The city not only controlled important trade routes, but also offered a psychological advantage. By conquering Lutetia, Caesar could undermine the confidence of the Gallic forces and dissuade them from further resistance. Caesar's decision to target Lutetia was a calculated one. After the setback at Gergovia, he needed to shift the momentum back in his favour. He knew that if he could capture Lutetia, it would deal a heavy blow to the Gallic rebellion and reaffirm Roman power in the region. Moreover, controlling Lutetia meant controlling one of the most important waterways in Gaul, giving him a strategic advantage that would serve him in future campaigns. The Parisii were well aware of the threat posed by Caesar's legions. Their leader, Camulogenus, an experienced and respected war chief, had already begun preparing the city for a Roman siege. Camulogenus knew that the Parisii could not stand against Caesar's forces in open battle, so he devised a strategy that would take advantage of Lutetia's natural defences. The island city, with its marshes and rivers, was nearly impregnable. If the Romans wanted to take Lutetia, they would have to wade through difficult terrain, all while under constant attack from Parisii warriors who knew the land intimately. But Caesar, too, was a master of strategy. He understood that a prolonged siege might cost him more than he was willing to pay. The Gallic tribes were still watching him closely, and any sign of weakness could spark a full-scale rebellion. Caesar's genius lay in his ability to adapt to any situation, and he quickly devised a plan to force Camulogenus into open battle. Caesar knew that the marshes and rivers surrounding Lutetia posed a challenge, but he had faced worse before. He ordered his engineers to construct makeshift bridges over the marshes and to clear paths through the dense foliage that surrounded the city. His legions, disciplined and experienced, worked tirelessly to prepare the ground for battle. Caesar's strategy was simple. He would draw the Parisii out of their stronghold and into a fight on open ground, where the discipline and training of his soldiers would give him a decisive advantage. To provoke Camulogenus, Caesar began marching his legions closer to the city, building camps at strategic locations around Lutetia. The Parisii, seeing the Roman threat advancing on their city, were forced to act. Camulogenus knew that he could not afford to let the Romans take Lutetia without a fight. His warriors were proud, and they were not willing to see their city fall to foreign invaders. Reluctantly, Camulogenus made the decision to meet Caesar's forces in battle. The Parisii warriors were formidable opponents. They were skilled in guerrilla tactics, often launching hit-and-run attacks against Roman forces. As Caesar's legions advanced through the marshes, the Parisii used their knowledge of the terrain to harass the Romans, striking swiftly before retreating into the safety of the swamps. Caesar's soldiers, weighed down by their heavy armor and shields, struggled to keep pace with their elusive enemies. The marshes were treacherous, and more than a few Roman soldiers found themselves stuck in the mud, easy prey for the Parisii warriors. Despite these early setbacks, Caesar pressed on. He knew that the key to victory was patience. The Parisii might have the advantage in the marshes, but they could not hold out forever. Caesar's legions were well-trained and highly disciplined, and he trusted in their ability to adapt to the difficult conditions. Slowly but surely, the Romans began to gain the upper hand. Caesar's engineers continued to build bridges and clear paths through the marshes, allowing his legions to advance more easily. As the Roman forces closed in on Lutetia, the Parisii were forced to make a final stand. Camulogenus, realizing that his hit-and-run tactics were no longer effective, gathered his warriors for a decisive battle. He chose his battlefield carefully, positioning his forces on a high ridge overlooking the Roman approach. The ridge provided a natural advantage, giving the Parisii the high ground from which to launch their attack. Camulogenus knew that if he could hold the ridge, he might be able to stop the Roman advance and save Lutetia from falling into enemy hands. The Battle of Lutetia was about to begin. Caesar, ever the strategist, recognized the importance of the ridge. If he allowed the Parisii to hold the high ground, it would make the Roman advance far more difficult. He ordered his legions to prepare for an uphill assault, knowing that it would be one of the most challenging battles they had faced so far in the Gallic campaign. The Roman legions formed up in their traditional lines, shields locked together in a nearly impenetrable wall of defence. The Parisii, meanwhile, prepared for a more chaotic, aggressive charge. Unlike the disciplined Romans, the Parisii relied on brute strength and ferocity to break their enemies. Armed with long spears and oval shields, they waited for the signal from Camulogenus to begin their attack. The battle began with a thunderous roar as the Parisii charged down the ridge, their war cries echoing across the battlefield. Caesar's legions held their ground, using their shields to absorb the initial impact of the charge. The Parisii warriors crashed against the Roman lines like waves against a cliff, but the Romans did not falter. Slowly, methodically, they began to push back, using their short swords to cut down the Parisii at close range. The fighting was brutal, with neither side willing to give an inch. The Parisii, driven by their desire to protect their homeland, fought with incredible ferocity. But Caesar's legions, hardened by years of warfare, were relentless. Despite the difficult terrain and the determination of their enemies, the Romans began to gain the upper hand. The Parisii, unable to break through the Roman lines, started to tire. Caesar, sensing that the tide was turning in his favour, ordered a full advance. The final moments of the battle were a slaughter. Caesar's legions surged forward, cutting through the Parisii ranks with ruthless efficiency. Camulogenus, realizing that the battle was lost, attempted to rally his forces for one last stand. But it was too late. The Parisii, surrounded and outnumbered, were cut down as they tried to retreat back to the safety of Lutetia. The high ground, which had seemed like an advantage at the start of the battle, became a trap for the Parisii as the Romans closed in from all sides. As the battle drew to a close, Caesar stood victorious once again. Lutetia, the stronghold of the Parisii, was now under Roman control. The Parisii, like so many other tribes before them, had been forced to submit to Roman rule. Camulogenus, their brave leader, had fallen in battle, and with his death, the last hope of resistance in Lutetia was extinguished. For Caesar, the capture of Lutetia was a critical victory. It restored his reputation after the setback at Gergovia and sent a clear message to the rest of Gaul. Resistance was futile. With Lutetia under Roman control, Caesar could now focus on the remaining rebellious tribes. But he knew that the Gallic War was far from over. Vercingetorix, the leader of the Arverni and the mastermind behind the rebellion, was still at large, and the final confrontation between Rome and the Gallic tribes was yet to come. The summer of 52 BCE was one of unrelenting struggle for Julius Caesar and his legions. Caesar's campaign to bring Gaul under Roman rule had encountered resistance at every turn, and the stakes were higher than ever. After the costly siege of Gergovia, Caesar's forces had suffered one of their few defeats, and Vercingetorix, the leader of the Gallic rebellion, was emboldened. The tide seemed to be turning in favour of the Gauls. But Caesar, ever the master strategist, was not ready to concede. He knew that the Gauls' newfound unity was fragile, held together by Vercingetorix's magnetic leadership. To truly break their resistance, Caesar needed to strike again, this time decisively. As the dust of the Gergovia defeat settled, Caesar began regrouping his forces. His legions, battle-hardened but weary, knew that they were far from finished with the Gauls. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix, basking in his victory at Gergovia, prepared his next move. The Gallic chieftain had adopted a new strategy, one that aimed to avoid direct confrontation with the Roman war machine. Instead of meeting Caesar's legions head-on, Vercingetorix ordered his forces to harass the Romans through guerrilla tactics, attacking supply lines and disrupting the flow of Roman reinforcements. He knew that if he could starve the Romans of their vital supplies, he could force Caesar into a corner. But Caesar was no ordinary commander. Where other generals might have hesitated or retreated in the face of such challenges, Caesar saw an opportunity. He recognized that Vercingetorix's strategy, while effective, was also risky. The Gauls were not accustomed to long, drawn-out conflicts. They relied on their home territories for sustenance, and their coalition was fragile. If Caesar could draw Vercingetorix into a battle on his own terms, he could deliver a crushing blow to the Gallic rebellion. The chance came near the river Vosges, in the region of modern-day Dijon. The terrain was rugged, a mix of rolling hills and dense forests, perfect for Vercingetorix's guerrilla tactics. But it also presented Caesar with an opportunity. If he could lure the Gauls into a pitched battle, his legions would have the advantage of discipline and cohesion. And so, with this in mind, Caesar began to maneuver his forces. The plan was deceptively simple. Caesar would use his cavalry, including allied Gallic horsemen loyal to Rome, to harass Vercingetorix's forces. Meanwhile, the Roman legions would maintain a defensive posture, securing key positions and waiting for the Gauls to make a mistake. Vercingetorix, for his part, was eager to press his advantage. The victory at Gergovia had made him overconfident, and he believed that Caesar was on the defensive. He took the bait. As the Roman cavalry skirmished with the Gauls, Vercingetorix ordered his warriors to pursue, thinking he had caught Caesar off guard. The Gauls, fierce and impulsive, charged down from the hills, eager for battle. But as they neared the river, the true nature of Caesar's strategy became clear. The Roman cavalry, feigning retreat, suddenly regrouped and launched a counterattack, driving the Gauls into disarray. It was at this moment that Caesar unleashed his legions. The sight of the Roman legions advancing in perfect formation, their shields gleaming in the summer sun, must have been a terrifying one for the Gauls. Trained to fight as individual warriors, the Gauls struggled to form a cohesive defence against the disciplined ranks of the Roman infantry. The legions, with their short swords and tightly locked shields, began to cut through the Gallic ranks like a scythe through wheat. Vercingetorix, realizing that he had been outmanoeuvred, tried desperately to rally his forces. His warriors, though outmatched by the Roman legions in open combat, fought with the ferocity of men defending their homeland. The battle devolved into brutal close-quarters combat, with neither side willing to give an inch. For hours, the two armies clashed by the river, the air filled with the sounds of steel on steel, war cries and the screams of the wounded. But Caesar had one more trick up his sleeve. As the battle raged on, he ordered a contingent of his cavalry to flank the Gauls from the rear. This manoeuvre, executed with precision, caught Vercingetorix's forces completely off guard. Surrounded on all sides, the Gallic warriors began to break ranks. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped between the Roman infantry and cavalry, with no escape route. Vercingetorix, seeing the tide of battle turning against him, made the difficult decision to retreat. He and his surviving warriors fled back to the relative safety of the hills, leaving the battlefield in Roman hands. The Gauls had fought bravely, but they were no match for the tactical genius of Caesar and the discipline of his legions. The Battle of the Vosges, though not as famous as some of Caesar's other engagements, was a critical moment in his campaign to suppress the Gallic rebellion. It marked the beginning of the end for Vercingetorix's uprising. Though he had managed to escape with his life, Vercingetorix's forces were severely weakened. Caesar, on the other hand, emerged from the battle stronger than ever. His legions had proven once again that they were the finest fighting force in the world, capable of overcoming even the fiercest of opponents. In the aftermath of the battle, Caesar wasted no time in consolidating his gains. He ordered the construction of fortifications along the river, ensuring that the Gauls would not be able to mount a counterattack. He also sent word to Rome, reporting his victory and seeking reinforcements for the final push against Vercingetorix. The battle had not only been a military success, but also a psychological one. The Gauls, who had once believed that they could defeat the Romans, now faced the grim reality that their resistance was crumbling. But Caesar's work was far from over. Though the victory at Vosges was significant, it was not the decisive blow that would end the Gallic War. Vercingetorix, though bloodied and weakened, had retreated to safer ground. As he regrouped, Caesar prepared for the next phase of the campaign. His next objective was to bring Vercingetorix into a final climactic battle, one that would determine the fate of Gaul. The Roman general knew that the Gauls, despite their losses, were still formidable. Vercingetorix's strategy of guerrilla warfare had proven effective at slowing the Roman advance. The Gauls could strike quickly, retreating into the forests and hills before Caesar's legions could mount a proper counter-offensive. Yet Caesar remained confident. His forces were experienced and disciplined, and he had a keen understanding of the land. He knew that if he could bring Vercingetorix into an open battle, the Gauls' superior numbers would count for little against the well-trained Roman legions. Word of Caesar's victory at Vosges spread quickly. In Rome, the news was met with celebration. The Senate, eager to see the Gallic War brought to a successful conclusion, granted Caesar additional resources and reinforcements. This show of support bolstered his efforts, allowing him to consolidate his gains and prepare for the final push against Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix, meanwhile, was not idle. He recognized the precariousness of his position and knew that another defeat could spell the end of his rebellion. He called upon his allies across Gaul, urging them to rally to his side for one final stand. His plan was to draw Caesar into a fortified position, one where the Gauls' knowledge of the terrain could give them an advantage over the Roman war machine. For this, Vercingetorix chose the hilltop fortress of Alesia, a seemingly impregnable stronghold. As Caesar prepared for the assault on Alesia, he reflected on the battles that had brought him to this point. The victory at Vinjan had been crucial, not only in weakening Vercingetorix's forces, but also in cementing Roman control over the surrounding regions. The battle had shown the Gauls that Caesar was not to be underestimated, even after the defeat at Gergovia. His resilience, tactical brilliance, and the loyalty of his legions had carried him through some of the most challenging moments of the campaign. For Caesar, the conquest of Gaul was more than just a military campaign. It was a chance to secure his legacy. With each battle won, his reputation grew, not just in Rome, but across the known world. The Battle of Vinjan was another step toward that legacy, another testament to his unmatched skill as a commander. With the stage set for the final confrontation at Alesia, both Caesar and Vercingetorix knew that the fate of Gaul hung in the balance. The rebellion had come so close to success, yet Caesar had managed to keep his forces intact and in pursuit of total victory. The coming siege would be the ultimate test for both leaders. Their armies, their strategies, and their will to win would be pushed to the breaking point. As the legions marched on, ready to meet their final challenge, the memory of the Battle of Vosges remained fresh in their minds. They had defeated the Gauls in open battle once again, proving that discipline and strategy could overcome even the fiercest resistance. The future of Gaul and the future of Caesar would soon be decided. In the summer of 52 BCE, a decisive confrontation unfolded in the heart of Gaul that would forever alter the course of history. Julius Caesar, the ambitious Roman general, was poised to confront Vercingetorix, the fierce leader of the Gallic resistance. This clash would not only determine the fate of the Gallic tribes, but also solidify Caesar's legacy as one of history's most formidable military commanders. As the Roman legions prepared to lay siege, the stage was set for a dramatic showdown at Alesia, where the might of Rome would face the indomitable spirit of the Gauls. The backdrop of the battle was the fortified hilltop town of Alesia, a strategic stronghold situated on a ridge overlooking the surrounding plains. The town was home to Vercingetorix and his Gallic warriors, who had united various tribes against the Roman invaders. The natural landscape of Alesia, with its steep slopes and rocky outcrops, offered a defensive advantage that Vercingetorix aimed to exploit. For the Romans, the siege of Alesia represented an opportunity to crush the Gallic resistance once and for all. Caesar, driven by ambition and the desire for glory, meticulously planned his campaign. He understood that this battle could be the decisive encounter that would determine the outcome of the entire Gallic wars. As Caesar approached Alesia, with an army of approximately 50,000 troops, he devised a plan to encircle the town and cut off any possible reinforcements for Vercingetorix. His forces began constructing a series of fortifications, including walls, ditches and watchtowers, to encircle the city. This monumental engineering effort would later be known as the circumvallation. Vercingetorix, aware of the Roman army's approach, understood the situation was dire. He gathered his warriors, urging them to prepare for a fierce defense. The Gallic leader sent out messengers to summon reinforcements from allied tribes across Gaul, hoping to amass a force large enough to break the Roman siege. His charisma and leadership inspired many to answer the call, and a coalition of Gallic tribes rallied to his side. As the siege progressed, the situation within Alesia grew increasingly desperate. Vercingetorix and his men were running low on food and resources. To conserve supplies, they resorted to rationing, but the tension within the walls mounted. The cries of the hungry echoed through the fortress, and morale began to wane. Vercingetorix knew he had to act quickly if he wanted to save his people. Meanwhile, Caesar continued to strengthen his position around Alesia. His men worked tirelessly, constructing defensive structures to prepare for the anticipated Gallic relief forces. The Roman general understood that the upcoming days would be crucial, and he was determined to maintain his siege at all costs. Just when it seemed that Vercingetorix was on the brink of defeat, hope arrived in the form of the Gallic relief forces. An army of approximately 100,000 warriors gathered to challenge Caesar's siege, intent on rescuing their leader and breaching the Roman encirclement. Under the command of various tribal leaders, they marched towards Alesia, ready to confront the Romans. The Gallic forces approached, their fierce war cries echoing across the plains. Vercingetorix, buoyed by the arrival of reinforcements, knew that this was his chance to strike. The plan was simple. The relief army would attack Caesar's siege lines from the outside, while Vercingetorix and his warriors would break free from Alesia. If successful, the Roman siege would collapse, and the Gallic resistance could reignite. Caesar, however, was not unprepared. Upon learning of the approaching Gallic reinforcements, he quickly adjusted his strategy. He divided his forces into two groups, one to continue the siege against Vercingetorix, and the other to confront the relief army head-on. This was a risky move, but Caesar was determined to maintain control over the situation. The tension in the air was palpable as the two sides prepared for battle. On one front, the Roman soldiers stood resolutely against the Gallic relief forces, while on the other, Caesar's legions closed in on the besieged warriors within Alesia. As the battle unfolded, both sides fought fiercely, determined to secure victory. The Romans, under Caesar's command, utilized their training and discipline to hold their ground. Vercingetorix's warriors, fueled by desperation and the need to protect their homeland, charged with relentless ferocity. The clash of swords and shields echoed through the battlefield, creating an atmosphere of chaos and intensity. Despite their bravery, the Gallic forces struggled to coordinate their attacks effectively. Caesar's strategic genius and his legions' training allowed them to repel the Gallic assault and maintain their siege. As the day wore on, the Romans began to gain the upper hand, pushing back the Gallic relief forces while simultaneously tightening their grip on Alesia. The culmination of the battle came as the Romans launched a counterattack, forcing the Gallic relief forces to retreat. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix's position within Alesia became increasingly precarious. Faced with dwindling supplies and no hope of outside assistance, he was left with no choice but to surrender. The surrender of Vercingetorix marked the end of large-scale Gallic resistance. Caesar's victory at Alesia solidified Roman control over Gaul and exemplified his military prowess. This decisive battle not only altered the landscape of Gallic resistance, but also showcased the Roman strategy and discipline that would become hallmarks of their empire. In the aftermath of the battle, the repercussions were felt throughout Gaul. The defeat at Alesia sent shockwaves through the tribes, many of which reconsidered their resistance against Roman rule. While some continued to fight, the unity that Vercingetorix had inspired began to wane, and the once powerful coalition of tribes struggled to maintain their strength. As the dust settled, Caesar returned to Rome with news of his triumph, solidifying his status as a national hero. The campaign in Gaul had not only expanded Roman territory, but had also provided Caesar with the wealth and military glory that would ultimately fuel his political ambitions. However, this victory came at a cost. The harsh realities of war were evident as the Romans faced the consequences of their actions. Many Gallic tribes were decimated, and the cultural landscape of Gaul began to change under Roman influence. The legacy of the battle would linger, shaping the future of the region for generations to come. The Battle of Alesia serves as a poignant reminder of the fierce struggles for control in ancient Europe. The bravery of Vercingetorix and the Gallic warriors stands as a testament to the human spirit's resilience against overwhelming odds, while Caesar's strategic genius showcases the military might of Rome that would come to dominate the ancient world. As we reflect on this pivotal moment in history, we gain insight into the complexities of power, identity, and resistance that continue to resonate today. In conclusion, the Battle of Alesia remains a significant chapter in the history of Rome and Gaul, illustrating the clash of cultures and the relentless pursuit of power that defined this era. The echoes of war would resonate through the ages, a testament to the struggles and triumphs of both the Romans and the Gallic tribes. In 51 BCE, the Gallic Wars reached their climax in a final desperate stand at Uxellodunum. Julius Caesar, having already subdued much of Gaul, turned his attention to the last pockets of resistance. The stakes had never been higher for both sides, as the outcome of this siege would determine the fate of the Gallic tribes and solidify Roman dominance over the region. In a dramatic showdown that would resonate through history, Caesar prepared to crush the final remnants of Gallic defiance. Uxellodunum was strategically located on a hill, providing its defenders with a natural advantage. The town was fortified with thick walls and a strong population determined to resist Roman rule. The Gauls, led by a chieftain named Lutetia, had united several tribes in a last-ditch effort to fend off the Romans. Vercingetorix's earlier defeat at Alesia had cast a long shadow, and Lutetia was determined not to let history repeat itself. Caesar approached Uxellodunum with an army seasoned by years of conflict. His legions, battle-hardened and disciplined, were ready to execute the strategies that had brought him victory time and again. The Roman general understood that the siege would require not only military might, but also psychological warfare. The Gallic defenders needed to know that resistance was futile. Upon arriving at Uxellodunum, Caesar quickly set up a blockade, cutting off all supply routes to the town. He ordered the construction of siege works, including ramparts and ditches, to encircle the settlement completely. Roman engineers and soldiers worked tirelessly, demonstrating the efficiency and organization that characterized the Roman military. The blockade isolated the defenders, and as days turned into weeks, the situation within Uxellodunum began to deteriorate. Inside the fortress, the mood was grim. Lutetia and his warriors faced mounting pressure as food supplies dwindled. The once hopeful atmosphere among the defenders began to turn to desperation. Caesar's strategy of attrition was working. The psychological toll of the siege weighed heavily on the Gallic defenders. The cries of the hungry echoed through the walls, and morale faltered as the realization set in that help from the outside was unlikely. In response to the dire circumstances, Lutetia organized raids against the Roman camps in an attempt to disrupt their operations and gather intelligence. However, these attacks were poorly coordinated and met with fierce resistance from Caesar's legions. The Romans, well prepared for such tactics, quickly repelled the Gallic raids, further demoralizing the defenders. Caesar, sensing the time was right to escalate his assault, ordered a direct attack on the walls of Uxellodunum. Roman siege engines, including ballistae and catapults, were brought to bear against the fortifications, raining down destruction on the town's defences. The sound of crashing stones and the screams of the wounded filled the air as the Romans pressed their advantage. As the siege continued, Lutetia made a desperate appeal to the neighbouring tribes, calling for a united stand against the Romans. Some responded, motivated by a sense of honour and the desire to protect their homeland. However, the lack of a coordinated response weakened their efforts. The Romans, having effectively isolated Uxellodunum, were determined to snuff out any hope of reinforcements reaching the beleaguered town. After several weeks of relentless assault, the Roman forces finally breached the outer walls of Uxellodunum. The Gallic defenders, exhausted and outnumbered, fought valiantly to protect their home, but were no match for the disciplined Roman legions. The battle devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat as the Romans pushed forward. In the midst of the chaos, Lutetia rallied his warriors for one final stand. He urged them to fight for their freedom, their families, and their land. Though their spirits were high, the odds were stacked against them. As the Romans pressed on, the defenders fought with fierce determination, but began to falter under the overwhelming pressure. In the end, the siege concluded in tragedy for the Gallic forces. Caesar's soldiers swept through Uxellodunum, asserting Roman dominance over the last bastion of resistance. The defenders, faced with defeat, fought bravely until the very end, but their efforts were in vain. The Romans emerged victorious, marking the conclusion of the Gallic Wars. The aftermath of the siege was a harsh reminder of the consequences of defiance against Roman rule. Caesar demonstrated mercy to some of the surviving defenders, but he also imposed harsh penalties on those who had resisted. Many were executed while others were enslaved, ensuring that the lesson of Uxellodunum would not soon be forgotten. The brutality of the siege and the subsequent punishment served as a stark warning to any remaining tribes considering resistance. With the fall of Uxellodunum, the once powerful Gallic tribes were effectively subdued, and Roman control over Gaul was solidified. Caesar's triumph marked the end of large-scale Gallic resistance, paving the way for the integration of Gaul into the Roman Empire. The legacy of the Gallic Wars would resonate throughout history, shaping the future of the region and influencing Roman policy for generations to come. In conclusion, the siege of Uxellodunum was not merely the final chapter of the Gallic Wars. It was a pivotal moment that underscored the relentless expansion of Roman power and the tragic fate of the Gallic tribes. The battle highlighted the complexities of identity, culture, and resistance in ancient Europe, serving as a reminder of the human spirit's resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. As we reflect on this decisive moment in history, we gain insight into the struggles for power, control, and autonomy that continue to shape societies to this day.